Welcome, Dr. Gurin.
Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I've heard so much about you from some of my important mentors, including Phillip Bowman, James Jackson, Tyrone Foreman, among others that have spoken very highly of you in recognition of your work more broadly, but in particular your work in helping to get the PRBA up and off the ground. So today we're going to talk a little bit about those historical moments and in particular your role in the moments. And so thinking back to 1975, 76, 77, there were a number of people entering the campus. Among them were James Jackson, and then many of his students, many of them graduate students working in the Department of Psychology here. And as you'll recall, there were eventually these folks came together with your mentorship to do a national survey of Black Americans, which turned out to be probably the most important national survey of its time, and has only recently been replicated in terms of its importance. So thinking back to those years, if you could tell us a little bit about how you initially got involved with James, how did you meet James, and how did you guys begin to work together?
Well, it starts before 75 in terms of my involvement. I was from the 60s on, really, what we used to call a program director at the Institute of Social Research, I'd like to, mention, in terms of any recognition, accolades, etc. This could never have happened without ISR. I mean, and I had, I came here after the war, got my PhD here, stayed on at ISR. I was there from the beginning. And by the 60s, I was a program director, now called a research scientist, which means I had achieved the tenure position. It's coordinated with a professorship in a department, worked my way through the ranks. And I had been involved in other surveys, and in the early 60s, when the civil rights movement started, I got interested really in doing research involving that. So I had done research of a manpower training program involving inner city youth in the early 60s, and in some other research involving the whole beginnings of the civil rights movement. But in the back of my mind towards and these were research where I was the study director. But I think in terms of my own involvement in relation to the program, the study we're talking about, I started feeling toward the end of the 60s, really, that I was at the survey center. We do large national surveys. In the 50s, I had done a big mental health study, which was not on psychiatric mental health, but it was really a study in the middle 50s, really, of the general American population in terms very much like the First Italian Black Americans, on how people are living their lives. A section on work, a section on family, a section on marriage, different aspects of their lives and how they were living, general questions. That had been part of the past. That kind of study that we really knew so little about, not just the Black population, but the Chicano population, which was also coming into the national consciousness. that what we really didn't have the kind of basic information that we get in surveys and that we'd gotten in the study I had done with Joe Viroff on sort of the general way it was white Americans are living their lives. And that kind of study would really be a good one to do, just in these very general terms. And then, but I said, I was not the one to do that study, that it had to be done, by people who in their guts knew the population they were studying. And so that, study like that had to have a African American running it. So there's a question, okay, who? And we were just, the universities were just opening up to the recruitment of black scholars, Chicano scholars, young guys, guys mostly in those days, but young men and women who are entering the academic ranks as assistant professors. And I'd come to all of this through my wife, Pat, who's was very involved in this from the very beginning, not just in these studies, but in just the whole issue of the whole civil rights movement and making it a part of academic life. And so we questioned really, that was sort of the idea, but we needed a young person to do it. And then in the early 70s, Pat was in the psychology department, and there's this young guy who's just coming, very, very bright, incredible energy, so on, and creativity, someone very, very energetic, lovely to talk to, and talented, who'd be marvelous and had excitement about everything going on. So we talked to him and said, we're looking to do this. Would you be sort of interested in doing something? He was in group dynamics, James, because he had been an experimentalist, never done a survey in his life. And he said, yes, he'd be very interested. So this is why ISR is so important. ISR, the Survey Center particularly, was run really as a bunch of individual entrepreneurs. We had a very, Angus Campbell, who's the first director of the Survey Research Center historically. There were a lot of graduate students in social psychology, and he was here, and he didn't come here and set up the Survey Center and the Institute, bringing a whole lot of people with him. They just brought a few people. This was a center, really. Michigan was really the center for social psychological type things at that time, with Dan Katz here and Newcomb, and so there's a lot of graduate students, really the top training place for social psychologists in the country, and we would sort of looking for homegrown people. So there was James and that, and he said he was interested. And the organization really was run where a lot of the early founders came here as graduate students that are hanging on the wall there. Came here as Bob Kahn was in social psychology. I was in social. A lot of people who became really who stayed on. And so that was the situation here, and what Angus Campbell had done essentially was create a survey center. Group dynamics are different. They came here with the top people, Cartwright, Lippert, the founders of Group Dynamics really came here to Michigan and founded it. And the early people here really, Bob Kahn was a graduate student in social psychology, and others here came here as graduate students, got their degree, usually on data we had gathered at the Service Center, started running big studies when they were just kids, study directors, and stayed on. And Angus Campbell developed a situation really where we met as an executive committee. This is all done within the Survey Center. We met as an executive committee, and people who had ideas and were running sort of small programs would come to the executive committees. Sometimes they needed some help in developing a proposal. They would write a proposal, and we got our own money. We were all sort of individual entrepreneurs. So I came to this executive committee that he established and said, this is an ideal time. We are uniquely situated to do what the most important thing, I think, in research that could be done right now would be a great national survey of the African American population here in the United States. And they thought it was a great idea. And I said, I will need some money. I've just talked to someone who'll be ideal for it, James Jackson, and he's ready to come and work here. And I can't remember how much money they did, but he was on, the university, so I'm sure we paid his summer salary, and some portion gave him some time off for teaching, and his mission really was to write a proposal, and they gave him support, the money support, to write a proposal to do a national survey of Black Americans, and so the money came really to the program I was doing, and I said I would work on him with it, and he knew Belinda, I don't really know the background for Belinda Tucker, but he said she would be wonderful to do it. And the three of us said, we got together and we started writing a proposal. Now, in those days, NIMH had established a minority center. I don't think it exists anymore as a separate center. I think it's been part of a lot of stuff. But there was a separate center to develop minority research, which was essentially African American and Hispanic. And we figured they were the ideal place to support the thing we were thinking about. And so we sat down to write a proposal for NIMH. And all this, I think it's interesting. While I was doing this, Pat had gotten very interested that we should also do one on Hispanics. So everything I'm talking about with respect to finding James and then doing it was occurring simultaneously with Hispanics. And Hispanics was sort of, the first opening of universities was to African Americans, and then Hispanics came, shortly, but still, at a later point. So there was no assistant professor who was Hispanic here. But I was then doing some part-time teaching in the Center for the Study of Higher Education. And into that center came a brilliant Chicano graduate student, and he hadn't quite finished, but he was older. He's about the same age as James. He had come to higher education later, So he was a mature guy, like James, very brilliant, very creative, and very energetic. And I said, he's not assistant professor, he doesn't have an appointment, but he's just unusually talented and creative. And we talked to him whether he might be interested, and he was. So just about the same time I was getting this, so I went to the executive committee again, and it was pretty much at the same time with James. I said, oh, by the way, we ought to also do this with respect to Hispanics, and made the same kind of arrangement with Carlos that we had made with James. Carlos was not an assistant professor, he was not teaching. So his appointment actually, I think, must have been full-time, I don't remember. And again, I think that's why I want to stress the importance of ISR. We were not a rich organization in the 60s. It wasn't like it's been, and how, as big as it is, how James is taking off with it and making it incredible. We were a place struggling along, living a little bit ahead of the, beyond. Jim Morgan was one of the people there said, he figures if we don't get any money for 3 months, we're done. So we had a little money. And the thing about, certainly about Angus Campbell was, he established, this is all institutional, but when they just came here right after the war and established ISR, and the university gave us a couple of rooms in the basement of the ed school and said, you're here, but you got to get your own money, and said, sure. Ren Likert, who was the head of ISR, not of the center, but the whole head, said, oh, we'll get our money, but if you want to, if you want us to get our own money, we have to keep our own overhead. And they figured, well, no matter how much percent overhead we give, any percentage of zero is zero, so sure, keep your own overhead. But that really is what made all this possible. So I think, we have an unusual relationship where we're part of the university, but not completely, where we get our own money and we keep our own overhead. And Angus Campbell established the principle that overhead is a common pot, that the overhead you get doesn't go to you, you don't get a piece of the overhead for your own research, the overhead goes straight into the common pot, and you use the common pot for common purposes. So there is, as poor as we were, there was money available to support what were, center-wide initiatives. And so they supported James, they supported Carlos, and Carlos wrote a proposal, and I can't remember, they both got done in about a year. In about a year, we were ready to submit them, both about the same time, and they both got accepted.
So a question about so I have a lot of questions just about this period.
Yeah, that's it.
So let's stick with a bit of the history on ISR. So my understanding is that several folks were initially recruited from the military, where they had been doing, cutting-edge social science, largely funded by the military at that point. And as the war came to an end, they were recruited by Michigan. And part of their interest, this is some information that Phil has shared with me, by the way, part of their interest at the time was that they would come to Michigan if they could have a place like ISR. And Michigan was interested in supporting ISR largely because it was seen as a way to recruit some of the top social scientists, right? So this idea that if you come to Michigan, you can be part of a center where you get to keep more of your research funds more autonomously. That was a large incentive to be able to get some of the top thinkers in the country to come to Michigan. And so if you can say just a little bit about that historical turn.
Well, it actually started in Washington. It didn't start in the military. So that's really incorrect. It was not at all. One of the studies they did was I think the first study they ever did was of the color of Army uniforms or something, but it is not historically attached to the military. It actually started the Survey Research Center. Well, there are two histories. There's the survey researcher and there's group dynamics. The Survey Research Center started in the Department of Agriculture, which might seem why the Department of Agriculture. Henry Wallace, who was, the head of the Secretary of Agriculture, he ended up he ended up as Roosevelt's choice for vice president in Roosevelt's third term, and turned out to be a very radical type Democrat, a real left Democrat. So that they had him as vice president from 44 to from 40 to 44, but then the Southern Democrats particularly wanted no part of him, and that's Harry Truman came in and then got president. But it started in Henry Wallace's Department of Agriculture, and Henry Wallace himself was a scientist and worked with in kind of agricultural science type things. And the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal in the 30s, was doing a lot of things trying to revolutionize the way agriculture got done, supporting a lot of innovation type things. And Henry Wallace, as the head of the Department of Agriculture, as the Secretary of Agriculture, and as a person with scientific background, got interested. It was a place that was interested in, we're doing all these things, trying to change the ways individualistic American farmers do their business. And it would be nice to know how they're reacting to all of this. And Rensis Likert, who was a survey type person then, somehow was in Washington, I don't know how, but he came and sold the Department of Agriculture the notion that, you're doing these things, you want to, you need to know how the farmers are reacting to it as a way of affecting how you try to approach them on it. And so he got support in the Department of Agriculture to set up a survey apparatus that would let you do national surveys. And the war came shortly after that. And so in the war, they did, he had established this facility really for doing survey researches. And then during the war, they did studies on people buying war bonds and stuff like that. And after the war, I think they went to Germany with some other social scientists to get some survey of German people, about the effects of the bombing, all the bombing, things like that. But it did not come out of the military. It came out really out of the Department of Agriculture. That's the survey center. Group dynamics had a completely different being. There was a guy named Lewin, who was one of the German Jewish refugees who came to America during the 30s, before when Jews could still emigrate if they were prominent enough. And Kurt Lewin came and eventually established a place in MIT, a place, well, they started in Iowa, they went to MIT, but Kurt Lewin, and he got, Cartwright and Lippert and Zander, the three people and Jack French, young people to work with him, and established a center for the study of group dynamics. So they had completely different things. And then Likert, I mean, the way I've heard it, Likert is sort of a little like James, always thinking of it. When he got established here at Michigan, Kurt Lewin died in 47 or so, right after they had moved to MIT and gotten established there. Kurt Lewin died, and they were then group dynamics people were looking for a new home, and Likert was instrumental in bringing them here to Michigan.
Okay, got it.
So
that's important.
But certainly it was not at all started. Its early ties were not military at all.
Yeah.
Now, maybe, I don't know where you got that from, but you could have gotten it from, I don't think anyone who was here before me is still around to have told you that, but I'm quite sure that's not true.
Well, that's great to learn. So during this time in the mid-40s, early 50s, I imagine in my mind's eye a number of, excited, inquisitive, creative social scientists coming to Michigan. Do you know why, there were other universities that people could have continued their careers at? Do you know of any reason why they chose Michigan at that time?
Well, I'd have to know really, I mean,
because there were so
whether
many
you
things.
have, whether you have specific names.
Yeah,
I think what's unusual, certainly about the survey center, is that the early people were homegrown. I mean, the people who came here were from Washington and set it up were Likert, Angus Campbell, Charlie Cannell, and Les Kish. I mean, those were the four people. Les Kish was the head of sampling. Charlie Cannell was the head of the field staff. Likert was sort of the, particularly involved with business. He studied businesses. And our early, our major beginning people were businesses. And in terms of military, I'll have to correct myself now if things come back to me. Actually, we did get early support from the Office for Naval Research. Has anyone talked about that? That was I think you look, some of these historical things that can be verified, I urge you to look up, because I can't trust. But the early thing, but that didn't support military research. The Office of Naval Research, for some reason, was very interested in just organizations and how you make for effective organizations. So they were a major early supporter of our whole early studies of industries, and we got money then from the industries themselves. But an early big program was what we then called the Program for Human Relations, but became the Program for the Study of Organizations, which was that. But, the people who ran that were, we all ran stuff when we were still, the studies themselves, when we were still graduate students.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting.
Warren Miller came here from, so we were just, Angus got very interested in political studies. So, he got interested and then he looked around. And it's interesting, the guy he singled out was not a preliminary political scientist, but Warren Miller was a graduate student in Syracuse, the Maxwell School. And he found them there. He was an assistant professor, didn't have his degree yet. He came and took over the election studies in a few years.
Wow. So, so just a brief comment on when we interviewed James. James talked about this internal development kind of orientation or policy, if you will, that was in place by the time he got here. And it turns out to be very important for the trajectory of the PRBA longer term. So if you could just say a little bit about what was the philosophy of this kind of internal development orientation.
And what exactly are you referring to? What aspect of things?
So what it turns out that a lot of people that worked with James, who were trained in psychology, not only worked on the National Survey of American Life, but were also retained by the University of Michigan with various faculty appointments in different colleges and departments. And so, because a good portion of folks were able to be retained at the University of Michigan, it created a working climate that allowed for a lot of excitement around the PRBA for an extended period of time. You could imagine if all those people were trained working on the National Survey of American Life and then they left to go to different universities, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, before the kind of communications infrastructure that we have in place now. If folks had left, there probably wouldn't have been as much productivity around the National Survey of American Life. The National Survey of Black Americans. So it becomes important that the University of Michigan was interested in hiring its own, right? In giving graduate students a shot at collecting national surveys, right? And working to retain them at the ISR or at, with faculty appointments in other colleges and departments at that time. And so there seems to have been an orientation at that period that was about, keeping people around. So if you can share what your thoughts were around on those issues.
Well, it was, you had, we came as graduate students. ISR was there, got interested in what ISR was doing, and then we went, we weren't hired as tenured people. We were hired as graduate students, all of us. We ran studies as graduate students, but we didn't have appointments, we didn't have tenure. And it was, who can survive? And the uniqueness was that we got our own money. We were responsible for getting our own money. And you kind of went through a testing period in which you, no matter how talented you were as a student, the question was, this is not a typical academic environment, and a person who could be brilliant going through the whole professorial route, there was a question, do you have, can you develop a kind of interest that had broader programmatic things, and can you fund yourself? It was as simple as that. That during there's a kind of Protestant ethic kind of think drawing on overhead was something for your own salary, for example. Overhead was there to support you, even your salary in fallow times, but you couldn't just sit for a year just drawing money out of overhead. There was a kind of internal ethic as well. So it wasn't a case where people said, Angus would always sometimes, I'd come in with an idea, something. I've made too completely the thing about we got our own money. We were then, there weren't a lot of outfits that could do national surveys, and we essentially had only one competitor for the type of things we did. That was NORC. I don't know if you've heard of them. They were a good national survey outfit, academically respectable. But they were, so a lot of things kind of came to us. This national mental health study that I did in the mid-50s with Joe Viroff, Sheila Feld later, came to us. There was a commission established by Congress to do a massive study of mental health in the United States, and they had different components. One economist directed a section on the economics, and you had sociologists, psychiatrists. They had 7 or 8 different studies. And someone said, what about the general public, General public, fine, I guess. Someone said, we ought to do a survey, fine. So they invited Angus Campbell and the head person from NORC to come and say what they would do, and Angus Campbell sold them the idea, so that study came to us. Not all laid out, just really, when I first got it, I went to the Boston where the thing was being run, said, you'd like a kind of national study, what exactly would you like? And what do you like to know? And one guy says to me, well, we sort of would like to know how folks are doing in America. So I came back and I said to Joe Viroff, well, it's very clear what they want is to know how folks are doing in America. So that's sort of what we sat down to do. And, so stuff came to us, and that sort of probably in some ways maybe the best thing I ever worked on there was something just came out of the blue. I got involved with studies of the early National Manpower Program. They came to us, They say, we got all these economists working on all this stuff, but, we'd like to sort of know something about the people who come into these. Kennedy established a vast manpower retraining program, a program for just taking people and training them for the work life. And they came, and someone had told someone that, you ought to know, in addition to everything else, something about the motivation of those people. So they came to us and said, we'd like to study the motivation of those people who are coming to the program, that kind of stuff. So stuff came to us that way.
Okay, so moving forward again, back up to the period whereby you're thinking about being involved with this National Survey of Black Americans and the National Chicano Study, and your wife Pat really worked closely with the National Chicano Study.
That's right.
And so, if you can, how did the proposal development take place? So, you went to the executive committee and said, would there be some general interest? They said yes. You said you had found a person that might be interested in writing a proposal. They said we'd have some interest. And then you went back to James and said, would you be interested in really doing this? And he says yes. And so what happens after that moment?
Well, after that, it started with James and Belinda and I sitting down and saying, okay, you know, we want to do a proposal, you know, how do we do it? And my memory is, and this may be incorrect, you could talk, you know, his father is around, they're all around, so many of them are around, that it was pretty much just James, Belinda, and me. I remember all the others getting very, very involved when we had the money and started writing the questionnaires. Then that was a real group project. I remember the proposal as really just James and Belinda and I had done the mental health study, which was had a big section on, so a big part is it, how does, not just studying sort of the psychological state of people, but what aspects of their lives were related to whether or not they needed help, they felt they needed help or went for help. So, you know, I knew about that, and that, you know, translating that into a study of Black Americans was pretty straightforward. It didn't really, there wasn't much thought that you know, there was feeling of certain differences that might be present, but we weren't sure. I think we just divided it up. So I wrote the first draft of the section on going for help and how that's related to things, and then you know, then we divided it up into different sections. I remember working on that one particularly, and then all of us really. I don't remember the. You know, but I took the mental health one and wrote the first draft of that as a whole section. But we had other sections as well. We kind of divided it up into different roles. There would be one on marriage and the family. There'd be a section on religious behavior, general sections, and kind of divided it. I remember very much that was one of the things I focused on, and we wrote drafts and checked the drafts, and so.
And then after you guys kind of got a draft together, what was the next stage? Does it go back to the executive committee before you send it for funding?
We never did that. Now they probably have a situation where it probably goes through 17 committees. I don't know. It was very incredibly non-bureaucratized, incredibly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's almost casual. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, so you guys send the proposal off, and it comes back, and you guys are granted a certain amount of funding to do the study.
That's right.
If you can share with us a little bit of your thoughts at that time about getting the funding and what your thoughts were now that you're going to have to actually do this study.
Well, the first thing you had to do, things that I feel I really didn't anticipate. I was never methodology. I mean, I was, you know, I was good in math. I was good in statistics and stuff, but it wasn't my central competence or interest. Frankly, I was interested in the substance. So I I didn't really have a sufficient realistic grasp of what it would take to do this study. I was used to the fact I had a study. I just worried about would go into it. For sampling problems, I would go to, for the drawing the sample, that would be the sampling people. Doing the interviewing, that would be the interviewing people, you know. Sampling people, I would talk to Les Kish and the person he would then assign to the thing. So I didn't anticipate the fact that we would have to draw a new sample. You couldn't draw a sample that was a sample drawn for the national Black American population. So that was a whole new sampling. You had to draw a sample. And you couldn't use the nice white interview ladies, white lady interviewers that we had. I mean, you had to have I thought you could use some. No, you had to draw a whole new staff to do a national interview survey, which are tremendous projects and tremendously costly. So I essentially didn't advise budget, really didn't face the budgetary problems and the just technical problems. And it's fortunate that I didn't, frankly, and that we had a system where it didn't have people over us saying, you just can't do that, didn't look at the proposal and say, there's no way you can do this. I mean, we had tremendous autonomy, and in this case, I think the Institute depended on the program directors, taking that responsibility, and they really didn't hover over us at all. And it was just under budget, and it was a vast job.
So do you remember, so eventually what had to happen, as you'll recall, is in order to get the sample that they were interested in, they had to build a different sampling frame to draw the sample.
That's right.
And that sampling frame had to be based upon the distribution of African Americans in the
Exactly.
US. And so this was the first methodological issue that folks ran up upon. Do you remember how that discussion was originally handled? Did you guys go to the sampling people first, or,
I wasn't, I think, James, I was really, it was not my expertise, and I remember James thinking about new techniques and stuff. I think James bore the brunt of that, I would say. You spoke to him?
Yes, we have, yes.
I would think he was more involved with the anxieties and difficulties, etc., of doing that.
And so, so they figure out the sampling frame, and drawing a sample from it. They also then run into a problem with interviewers because, as you mentioned, it probably wouldn't work very well to send white women into these, which was the convention at the time, to send white women into these mostly black neighborhoods First of all, black people probably would not have been receptive to talking to white women in the first place.
Oh, I think that was a very, very big part of it, mostly. I mean, there was a real, incredible commitment to that this just could not be done, and I think white people were resistant. White social scientists. What do you mean? I talk to farmers. I mean, a surveyor. You talk to people who backgrounds you don't know. But I think by that time I'd been dealing with these issues and doing studies for a while on these issues, and I'd come to that feeling also that this is. So
after they trained the new interviewers, they had to train a bunch of black interviewers to do the study, and they go out in the field and they get the data and they bring it back. And I think I heard you mention, and this would line up well with some other things I've heard about the period, is that the initial study came in a little bit under budget. And so there was
a little bit, a very generous understatement.
Okay.
And that one for which I take a lot of the real responsibility. I should have known better.
Okay, so was it over budget or under budget?
Under budget.
So that meant that there was money left over after doing the survey.
Oh no. Oh, it was. I thought was the proposal under budget. Oh no, there was we were tremendously under in our estimation of what it would cost.
Okay, so you estimated a lower cost than what
much. No, we didn't. Okay. We had nothing there for creating a whole new interview staff, a whole new sampling frame. We had nothing really in there for that. I mean, it's madness.
So how did you get the extra money after? Because the grant had already said we'll give you the money you asked for. How did you get the extra money?
Well, I was an eternal optimist. I was never a great estimator, and I'd always managed to get the extra money. And I figured, these were, and this was true of, it was even a worse problem, Hispanics, because the Hispanic population was much more mobile, and so, doing it. I'll mention one thing. The sampling guy told me, you guys are doing it at the worst possible time, the end of the decade, so you're using census data that's 7-8 years old to establish new things, which was not, I don't think that horrendous a thing for African Americans, but was a horrendous problem for the Hispanic study because there was tremendous variation. But yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, but the question again was.
Right. So.
How did we get the money?
Yes, the extra supplemental money in order to address some of these challenges.
Well, we ran over budget, and it was a question of getting, some. We tried foundations. We did get, I think, a couple of $100,000 from the Ford Foundation, just really to help bail us out. And it was a big chunk of money for each of these two studies was eaten by the Survey Research Center. I mean, by the Institute, but the money was in the Survey Research Center. So and this is another thing. This is this is something about the Institute, the ISR. They did it, and they did it without any, I wasn't fired, James wasn't fired. James is now the head of ISR. Yeah. These were very, very serious drains on the overhead of the thing. And they bore it, and they bore it without, I was never drawn in and said, how the hell did you let this happen? Well, this is important. Could not have been done without this place.
Absolutely. So when the survey was originally done and data were collected, there was no program for research on Black Americans. Do you remember how that ended up developing, from going from a survey to a program?
Well, I'll tell you my part of it.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's very important. I was thinking of a study, and doing a nice study, and I was thinking of James. This is a wonderful guy. We ought to keep him in Michigan. So I was, and he was a very good friend, James. I really was very involved in having a very nice study and helping him start a very nice career. And I never intended to stay on. I mean, I saw my role as helping this get started. But, you know, we were in this, in the beginning, you know, we had gotten the money, and we're getting this thing started with all its problems. And I see James one day and find out he's working on another proposal. He said, what? Well, I said, I hear you. No, there's nothing. There's just a proposal to bring students here for a summer, just a proposal for summer money to bring 7, 8 graduate students here to work in the summer, and we'll teach them a little about survey techniques and how the data were gathered, and they'll look and they'll have a chance, a little analytic training, and they'd have a summer learning about the study and deciding what aspect of the study they would do for a PhD thesis. So I said, James, you know, this is a massive thing you're involved in. You can't give your whole summer to training students. He said, never forget, he said, what do you think this is all about? What do you think this is all about? Never forget it. You know, James is a very, very ambitious guy, as much as anyone else. But I haven't met anyone who really has been, certainly no one's been so individually successful, who really, really, really cares about his role. And that's what he sees his role, as a trainer of all these graduate students coming to a university that was opening up to them. So he went ahead and did it, and I had nothing to do with that proposal. I had nothing to do. I was against his doing it. I didn't argue with him. Not going to argue with a guy who says to me, you know, what do you think this is all about? So I said, and then I realized, certainly at that moment, that he not only didn't need me anymore, I was just, you know, I'd be lecturing him about he should think about himself more. So that's it, and I really have, I had nothing to do really. He'd come, we'd talk a little, and there was always these ideas of what's the next step and how to make it. So I didn't really, I can take Pat really, but Pat and I take credit for discovering James. Not that he would believe me, if we hadn't been there, that there would have been some people there who would eventually gotten the idea. I didn't envision this as this guy would someday be a leading figure in, not that he didn't have the ability, but I didn't say, this is a visionary who will, I said this guy is going to be one of the leaders in this whole group of African American students that are coming in. He's going to be a leader of the whole generation that is being trained now. But it's funny, it doesn't surprise me that he's this way. It's just, it wasn't part of my vision. I was just looking for a bright, talented, creative guy who could do a real nice study and then go on to other things he would do. I knew he would do other things, but that he would make this the basis for his whole visionary thing. It was a nice addition after I stopped telling him to worry about tenure.
So I've heard you talk a little bit about, in a couple of different moments, you've talked a little bit about your observation of various young scholars and trying to identify people who you thought really had potential to really do a lot of insightful and important work over their careers. The PRBA is currently in a stage where we're thinking about bringing along, if you will, sort of another group of young, yet to be proven scholars. What do you think are some of the core attributes that are important as people begin to sift through a potential team?
Well, the obvious ones, you got to be smart and you got to be energetic, And just be creative. And what is that? Not just, taking old concepts that have been around forever, give them a little twist or turn. I don't know. I find that you sort of, one of the Supreme Court judges said about pornography, I can't define it, but I know when it's there. I don't know what it was about James. He was always thinking of, I think I found this whole vision of this and the summer thing, and eventually people come around. Study's been around a while, but the training is such an integral part of it was something very. But it took me a while to really. And then he was always thinking of new things to do. The newness of it, not these sometimes supposedly very bright academics doing little twists on old ideas, or they're new ideas. He had an idea about sampling. I don't think it ever got. You said, people were saying, you go into a completely white neighborhood trying to find the one or two black people in it, going every. He said, do we have to go to every door? I don't know. I don't even know. This was an idea he had. You choose 3 or 4 places in the neighborhood, and you don't have to go to every door to find if there's a black person in a predominantly white. Things like that. I mean, I don't know that he ever even followed that up. I don't think so, but you know.
He did follow it up.
That's it, yeah.
And it's now, you know, a core methodological contribution in the area of sampling small populations.
Did you know that James
yes,
did?
Yes, I did. It's called the
did?
wide area sampling procedure. Nickname WAS.
I know. You know, I didn't even know that. You know.
Yeah. So that.
I really don't know. I think purposely I felt. You know, I've known all the people. I'm very good friends of Phil, particularly. You know, but I think I made it. I mean, as we talk, I sort of wonder why. You know, I haven't. I don't know why I haven't. I love those days. I look back on those days. I love those people. I see the people individually. But I think probably I felt, you know, I'd done what I could do, and it was in hands way beyond the possibilities even I had seen. I haven't really. I see James, ask him what he's doing, but I haven't. I've had a feeling this was a wonderful time and wonderful memories, but like I had a function, I did it, and so I haven't really followed up at all. I didn't know that WAS was, it's incredible. Yeah. That is incredible. Is he given credit for that, James?
He is given credit.
I mean, that was...
certainly around here he's given credit. I haven't yet. My conversation with James lasted, you know, we ran out of time, so we're going to come back to it. I don't know to what extent it's been published in that way. I know there's some sampling. In fact, this is the National Survey of Black Americans sampling stuff. And in the front sections is some discussion of how the sampling was done. And there's also some stuff that's published too. But yes, certainly everyone around here knows that, in fact, the idea came to him in the middle of the night. And he woke up in the middle of the night and said, I got it. This is how we can save a bunch of money while still finding all the black people. Turning to a little bit of a side, so these days ISR has a number of summer programs, right? So they have the ICPSR program for quantitative methods, and they have the ISR Survey Research Summer Institute. It's, according to your recollection anyway, I mean, it's something I can also check, but it was this idea to bring graduate students, to fund graduate students to study over the summer and get trained over the summer. Was that happening when James proposed that idea? Were there these summer institutes at ISR at the time?
It started, I think it started with Les Kish.
Okay.
That, and I think the earliest, it became broader certainly, but the initial impetus, and I think the probably first one or two summer institutes came from Les, and he saw it as his way of training the world in sampling. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think at some time when he retired, I think every sampler, and he trained the whole world, all the third world countries, just starting to do surveys to get some handle on what they had to do. I think they all came here for training in the summer. Now it quickly got broader than that, but that was always that was the initial population that dealt with was samplers. And that was Les's, he got funding from some foundation to establish it. And then it broadened very quickly to just certainly giving courses in survey techniques and so on. And it got more sophisticated as ICPSR took it over.
So, so of course, if you want to take a break and have a little water.
I'll have some water.
It's a lot of talking.
Well, I'm glad to hear about WAS. I think I've learned a lot. I've learned things here. This has been very nice.
Good. You all right?
Yeah, I'm fine.
So of course, the National Survey of Black Americans, take your time.
No, I'm fine.
All right. It wasn't just James and Belinda, right? It wasn't just James, it was also Belinda and a number of graduate students. So if you could just tell us a little bit about your early interactions with Belinda Tucker a little bit.
I don't know. Pat had more interaction, but no, she was James's choice. We didn't really know her that well. Just Pat knew her. Pat was in the psych department. Just knew her as a very, 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 very bright, very lovely, but also very lovely, bright person. She did something for Pat. She wrote up something that a collaborator of Pat's had not been able to write up. And she did a very nice job. I mean, she did it on Pat's project and got paid for it. Just did a very nice job writing that up. So, but she was James's choice, and I didn't know her at all. And Pat said, when I said, no, James has, there's this graduate student, James is going to be part of writing the proposal. And Pat said, gee, she's great.
And so another name that I've heard you mention that you've had some interactions with that was part of this early team of researchers is Phillip Bowman. So if you could just say a little bit about, your interactions with Phil and, those kinds of things.
I had done a study in the 60s on college students, and through that got associated. I hadn't taught the first 20 years here. I got associated with, they have a very nice Center for the Study of Higher Education. I know a lot of, they came, and a number of their students used my data to get their degrees. And they wanted to know if I'd like to teach a course on the college student. I did, and I got associated with them. Half time of the academic year, got a professorship with them. And I taught a course on the urban college student with Murray Jackson, who was at the center, and a guy who knew the urban scene. And into this course comes this guy who's they're very smart students and even very good academic students. But this is a guy who seemed to be a real academic, I mean, the people it trains are, a couple of them become teachers, but there are people go on to be big honchos in universities. And here's this guy who really loved to talk and very, very academic and a very interesting academic mind, and a guy that certainly by now I'm sure it's not true, but in my day, we're not just looking for bright students, we were looking for students, whether Hispanic, African, but students who could bring some new kind of vision to academia, thinking it from what's the benefit to academia. And here was this guy who would take these concepts and always had a slant on them that came from his experience and his background in a way I hadn't seen anyone do really up to now. And he was in higher ed. I remember, I said, I love the people in higher ed. They're very smart, but you're like a real, like a real academic. Why don't you go to social psychology? And I told him to talk to Dan Katz, who was here, and to talk to, I think, to take Dan Katz's course. And so I think I helped. I just suggested he switch to psychology. So I know him, from the time he came here. And
what are some of your memories of being in conversation with Phil?
I just find him, people say he talks too much, and he probably does. I have gone to lunch with, as I told you, he comes late, so that cuts the time there, but makes up for it. We've gone to the Union a number of times when they had their place there, and he'd get there at 12:30 and not 12, but we were always the last people out. They would clear the dishes. I remember once sitting till 3 o'clock, only people there talking to them, and him talking, really. And he just has, he's worked in the work area, the job area, and I did on the manpower training stuff. Just has a way of giving it a twist that comes from his experience, taking some of these standard concepts and giving them a real twist that comes from his experience. And then I remember once a lecture on the power dynamics in Chicago. I don't know. I just find him fascinating to listen to. So.
You will be happy to learn that over the years, Phil, of course, he left here and he went to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign for a while. He was also at Northwestern.
That's right.
And he was also at the University of Illinois Chicago.
That's right.
It used to be the old Circle campus. And they've actually, he did such great work getting a center there up and running called the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, that they now have a standing annual lecture named the Phillip Bowman Lecture.
You are kidding.
Yeah. So
you are kidding.
Even though he's come back here, he goes back annually to Chicago.
I didn't know that. I don't think Pat knows that. Yeah. Pat was his dissertation chairman.
Yeah, so they have a full lecture on race and public policy in his name that's given every year.
We're at Illinois,
Chicago. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so you'd be happy to know.
Wow.
So there were also some other folks hanging around. I don't know how much you came into contact with people, but I'll just throw out names and just see if it rings a bell at all. So other people were Cleopatra Caldwell.
Sure.
Yeah. So what do you remember about Cleopatra?
I don't remember her much from those days. I know her there. I don't, but I've come to know her. My granddaughter went through Michigan and ended the last 2 years, working part-time with Cleo. So we've got to know Cleo and around Chloe, and worked with her, did one thing with her, and Phil, actually. Phil and I worked on, we got some money from the Labor Department, did some studies there on. She works too hard in a way, I think. I've gotten to know her personally. The stuff she did when we worked together was very nice, but it's a small study, it's not a, so it isn't, the main thing is, when we meet, we talk about personal things more than the work.
Mm-hmm. And do you recall at all a young man by the name of Woody Neighbors? People used to call him Woody.
Oh, yeah. Well, Woody I know very well because he first approached me, I guess we had just gotten our money but hadn't really started, or maybe were working on the proposal even. And he came to talk to me about my mental health study, and particularly sort of the going for help process. So we talked a lot about that. He was developing his dissertation proposal. And so we talked a lot and went to lunch, and I was on his committee.
He had spent a lot of time working in a community mental health center, and had
that was after, wasn't it after he left? Was it before? I think
he came he came into graduate school, left graduate school for a couple of years.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Worked at the community center.
And then came back. I didn't know that. That I didn't know.
Yeah, and then it turns out that some of the question testing for the survey was driven by the fact that black people ask for help and seek mental health and identify mental health issues in a different way than whites, at least certainly during that period of time. And so Woody was very instrumental in helping to make sure that the questions that were asked on the NSAL on those issues were...
Yeah, we were, when we were we got the money first, and then when we were writing the questionnaire, we divided into, that's when I got to meet everybody. Once we had the money and James brought them all aboard, we divided up into groups, each group of 2 or 3 taking one of the sections. So I remember being with Woody in the group that talked about the questions.
Do you have any memories of a young man by the name of Robert Taylor?
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah.
So how did you first meet Robert?
Well, I met him really around, he and Linda came, I don't know what exactly, we didn't really interact. I remember once they were involved in the interviewers and the interview problem. I remember talking about them. They were very concerned about interviews. They had a whole new set of interviewers. They were trying to supervise them from here, and they were down south or wherever, in the rural south, trying to get interviews. I remember once talking to them about, I think I remember having a talk with Robert and someone else, first getting a sense of real difficulty getting the interviews done. Just that, new people and no real supervisory structure, and miracle the thing got done, frankly. Real miracle.
Absolutely. And another young man at that time was named Wayne McCullough. Do you remember Wayne at all?
Well, yes. I love Wayne, and I particularly love Sherry. They're just lovely people. Wayne we knew, and he was interested in identity. We talked about identity issues, and just, very bright and unusually nice, I think. Just very nice Campbell. And,
so there was something that developed with Wayne at a particular point in time. As he was finishing up, he was appointed as sort of a faculty associate of the ISR. And he wasn't necessarily provided with a full definition of what that meant at the time. And it ends up being a pretty important part of his later trajectory.
I didn't know that.
Do you have any knowledge about how he got named faculty associate, or?
I don't know, Pat. I'll talk to Pat about that because I didn't know that. I think she must have been on his. She worked with Wayne as from her department position. I think she was on his committee. I don't really know what. I know he was involved in our management stuff. Didn't he get something in? Didn't he get an industrial job?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, he ended up going into industry. He worked for IBM for a bunch of years. And
that's
then
right.
he spread it out after that. So let me quick just check here. All right, so far we've talked about a lot of different things. Are there any moments that stand out as important in your memory over this period of time relative to the PRBA? Just important moments, small moments, big moments, but things that you've held on to over the years.
Well, Pat and I remember the time as a great period of our lives. And PRBA was, a major part of it, but it was a time when things seemed possible in the country. The country really seemed possible. And it was the combination, it was not PRBA alone. There was the combination of, there was PRBA and all these wonderful graduate students, and there was the Hispanic study with all amazing, that, Michigan at that time had more Hispanic, the Department of Psych had more Hispanic graduate students in the Michigan Department of Psychology than Texas or any California university. It was a great university, not just ISR that supported it, that made Hispanic students come here. Rather, these are Chicanos, that came from California and Texas. They came here, not their home states. And the country seemed, committed, and all these things were changing, and the universities were opening up and getting a little color in what had been a completely white university, and the whole country seemed different, even with Reagan, or because pre-Reagan or Carter was not inspiring. I don't know, it just felt that things were really, really happening and really, really changing, and you were part of it. I was part of it. So I've always gotten kicks out of feeling that my work, I'm as ambitious as anyone else and looking for fun as much as anyone else. But, since I was a kid listening to Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s, I got a special joy and gratification about feeling that I was part of something that went beyond the self. And there was that feeling here in the university that Pat had and I had. And we had parties. We had a great big room in our old house, and we had these wonderful parties of all these wonderful Black students and Hispanic students. There wasn't that much interaction really, but like we felt sort of we were like part of not just the Black study, but the whole change that was happening in higher education that involved Hispanics later also. And I remember the parties we used to have. I think my greatest pride, more than discovering James Jackson, I made margaritas that the Chicano Studies used to call for. They wanted my margaritas, so we still are in touch with them. So whenever I go, Aida Hatano was one, and Jackie was one, and whenever we go to California, I go there. Aida kisses me and says, "We are waiting for your margaritas." I just felt like wonderful things were happening, and I really remember the parties with everyone dancing and drinking and everyone young. We were, everyone just sort of young, and a feeling that the world was really opening. Certainly, the academic world.
So this is something that everyone has talked about that we've interviewed so far, the parties. James, Woody, Wayne are the people that we've talked to so far, and all of them have mentioned in one way or another parties. To what extent do you think that the kind of closeness that was a part of being social with one another fed into the work or helped the work, or what do you think the relationship was?
I don't know, better or worse, it made the work more joyful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know that they're separate in my mind, certainly. I think I've certainly been involved in things that I've gotten a lot of gratification from that didn't have any real important personal element. I just think it made it an unusual joyous time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember that as, particularly, I can't say, I saw James and I knew that someday he'd be head of ISR. I must say that I never thought I'd live to see an African American the head of ISR as much as I love ISR. And I don't know, just remembered as a wonderful thing and a wonderful time.
Okay, so let me see here. I think we're about wrapping up. Oh, so if you can tell us a little bit about some of your main teachers and mentors.
Well, they had, I came out in 47. I got out of the Army a year or two before. I wanted to stick around New York, so I took a master's in psychology at Columbia, and then figured I'd go for a PhD, and I came out here. I came to Michigan because Michigan, when I came out, was just starting a program, an interdisciplinary program in social psychology, in which they you took separate courses in sociology and took 2 prelims in sociology and took separate courses in psychology and took 2 prelims in psychology. So you took 4 prelims and you took courses in both the departments. So it combined both a sociological and psychological perspective, and I was interested in both, really. I tend to think as a psychologist. I tend to think as in terms of individual motivations and personal things that determine the way people live their lives. But ideologically, I think that the systemic opportunities and barriers are critically important, and you really have to understand them. I can't, I can think of them in terms of, minorities and people generally without power and stuff, but I don't think in terms of abstract sociological concepts. But ideologically, I think certainly, and I think, I think particularly in the early days of studying minority issues, you focus too much on psychological pathology. It was, you got called a victim blamer, and appropriately. I don't like the. So I came out to this program, and it was, and you got your degree in social psychology. It was just an ideal program. The head of it was Ted Newcomb, who, I don't know if you know social psychological history. Well, the Bible in social psychology was a book by Murphy, and Newcomb. Gardner Murphy was really sort of one of the founders of psychology. And Ted Newcomb then was a younger person who had worked with the 2 Murphys, him and his wife, and written this really standard book called Experimental Social Psychology. So he was here. He was a delightful person, very smart, very affable. And shortly afterwards, Dan Katz, and he was attracted by really the Institute. He had worked in Washington, I think, and some of the work they had done there, and he was at Brooklyn College. He was the head of the department there. He had written a very famous early book in social psychology. He came out half a year later, and those were my really 2 mentors. Mm-hmm. Dan Katz more than Ted Newcomb, of course. He was just a wonderful person. James, has named his professorship after Dan Katz. He was just a wonderful humanistic person. And he was incredibly important. He came here, but then he shifted to the department. He was a very prominent, well-loved, respected person in the department. So when Pat was working on a study of black colleges down south and really felt the need for an African-American collaborator, we found Ed Epps. Mm-hmm. And do you know Ed Epps?
I know of
Ed. Yeah.
Yes.
So he had worked with a guy named Erwin Katz who was here, and we had read his stuff. So we talked to Dan and said, we'd like to sort of invite him here. And Dan Katz said, why don't we make him an assistant professor? So so I said, well, he's a sociologist. So Dan said, sociology people here are racist, or he used the term that was appropriate, that you don't want him near them. But psychology, we love to have him, and got him an assistant professorship appointment. Yeah. So he was that kind of a guy. So he was incredibly supportive of all the stuff we were doing here.
Wow, that's interesting. That's really interesting.
He was great. His father had been a big union organizer in the international the Wobblies, the radical union at the turn of the 19th century. His father had been at that. And he approached it really from a real humanistic point of view. So he became a very, very dear friend of ours. Very, very good friend. And a very wise man.
All right, so I think we just have a few minutes here, so let me see if any of these are really relevant. What's your, I know you haven't been, around on the day-to-day stuff of the PRBA lately, but what's your kind of perspective on the PRBA today in terms of what you know about it, if anything? And also, what's your perspective on what you hear about other people saying about the PRBA?
I haven't really, I think we're generally not, we're not involved with ISR type academics anymore, with survey people, not really close friendship. The very close friend was Les Kish, but he's gone, and very involved with Rhea, but we talk family stuff with her and world stuff. So I'm just myself, I bumped into James once in a while and ask him what he's doing, and 5 minutes later I kind of stagger back to the office. I just all involved with integrating social psychology with bio, with brain stuff, with bio stuff. He's just managed to keep an incredible involvement with things that are at the height of that are, or really at the beginning of big talking about involvement with brain stuff before it became popular. And I'm just amazed at his just capacity to keep changing, to do things sort of before or just as people were starting to think of branching out, from what was after a very little study, just branching out from how much, and how different it was from, my vision of, get this very bright guy and get him tenure, he'll get tenure in Michigan, then be a, very nice, influential academic. But, you just think of, we had talked, you were talking about, in that original group of graduate students, Rob Taylor is a professor, Linda Chatters is, is a tenured professor, Woody Neighbors, Phil has been in and out of it, Cleo, 5 of them with tenured appointments at the University of Michigan from ISR, from the
Not
survey
only
center.
tenured, but I think everyone that you've named is a full professor now.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing from one little underfunded study, I mean, nothing, it's kind of amazing. He chose them all.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know them, so I had nothing to do with that.
Mm-hmm. So as we sort of close out here, we have what I think is a good amount of time remaining. So if you have anything else, actually not so much. The last thing I'm going to ask you to do is just to look into the camera and we're going to play this little clip as part of several clips strung together at the beginning of the reunion. And so we're just going to ask you to welcome people to the reunion. Yeah. So whenever you're ready.
Well, I want to welcome you all to the reunion, to the reunion of the Black Study, and to ISR and the University of Michigan. I think to the environment, really, to the place that that sponsored the Black Study, that supported it when it was not a famous study, but supported it in its early struggles, and really supported and has continually supported James's vision, not only of what he wanted to do, but now that he's the head of ISR, his vision really of what social psychology and academia generally should do, and the contributions it should make in our current world. We certainly could use more places like ISR and more people like James.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think that's all. That's all.
Well, this was a pleasure.